Nigel Gould Davies wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on the 1st of the year, January 1st. It was a guest essay. It was titled, "Putin Has No Red Lines." And if you're not familiar with Nigel Gould Davies, he's a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's well-respected, highly regarded international policy expert. And he starts out by asking, what are Putin's red lines in terms of this war in Ukraine? What can we do that will provoke a response from him that we would not want, like using nuclear weapons? And he then immediately says, that's the wrong question to ask. And he says in fact, we shouldn't even be thinking in terms of red lines because there's pretty much no such thing. First off, red lines are negotiating tools. They are not lines drawn in the sand or whatever. In fact, the phrase he uses is red lines are actually more often red herrings. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he mentions this, Khrushchev said, if you try to stop us from putting our missiles in Cuba, since you've got missiles in Turkey, you've got missiles right on our border. We have a right to have missiles on your border. If you try to stop us from putting missiles in Cuba, we'll start a nuclear war over this. We will attack you. And John Kennedy called him up and said, cool. You will be destroying yourself. But if that's what you want to do, we're here. We're ready for it. We're not going to let you put those missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev backed down because it wasn't really a red line. It was a bluff. When Barack Obama, when he was president, and he said if the Russians or the Syrians use chemical weapons against their own people, against the Syrian people, that would be a red line that would provoke a quote, enormous consequences, was the phrase that Obama used. And then, sure enough, the Russians and the Syrians used poison gas against Syrian civilians, and we did nothing. We didn't respond. When we said that if the Taliban gets back into Kabul, if they try to take part of Kabul, that will be, that'll provoke a huge response, and yet suddenly it wasn't a red line for us anymore. So he says, in truth, red lines are nearly always soft, variable, and contingent. He says the second flaw of red line orthodoxy is that you have to take into account both the costs of escalation and the benefits. And then he notes, and there are, the benefit to ending the war in Ukraine is substantial to the world. I mean, literally people are starving around the world right now because Ukrainian food, Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, and with regard to wheat, that food is not being exported, or much of it is not being exported. So what do we do? Well, he's saying that, our concerns about Russian red lines, I'll just quote, he says, concerns about Russia's red lines are driven, above all, by the fear that Russia might resort to nuclear escalation. The West should avert this by deterring Russia rather than by restraining itself or pressuring Ukraine to be restrained. And also, we should be communicating to Russia the certainty of severe consequences should they use nuclear weapons. And those consequences would not be nuclear retaliation. Those consequences would be economic, that we will basically destroy their country economically. He says the West should now aim to persuade Mr. Putin that withdrawing his forces from Ukraine is less perilous than fighting. He will be likely to do so if he understands that a long war threatens his regime by fatally weakening domestic cohesion or by escalating out of control. And, he makes the point that the one thing that Putin wants is for his regime to survive, right? So he notes America should focus on three things. First, he says it should no longer declare that there are measures it will refrain from taking and weapon systems it will not provide to Ukraine. He says to signal unilateral restraint is to make an unforced concession. Worse, it emboldens Russia to probe for and try to impose further limits on U.S. action, making the war more, not less risky. Second, he says, with its partners, America must make it clear that time is working against Russia, not in its favor, as Putin apparently believes. And third, he says the West should make clear to a wide range of Russian audiences that it is safe to end the war by leaving Ukraine. An orderly withdrawal is unlikely to lead to regime change, let alone the breakup of Russia. Neither outcome is the official goal of Western policy. I read this and I thought, oh my God, this guy, you know, I'm no expert on military strategy or foreign policy, but this makes so much sense to just say, no, you know, you cannot attack another democracy. Yes, I get it that, you know, you believe that they are actually your property and you own them, but you can't do that. And yes, I get it that we've been hypocrites and we've done the exact same thing ourselves in the past, but we're not doing that now. And we're not going to let you do this with a democracy.